The Texas sun burned low over endless fields of wheat and wire. Beyond the fences, rows of German soldiers stood silently. Their uniforms faded, their pride fractured by defeat. A few leaned against wooden posts, others stared toward the horizon where freedom seemed both close and impossibly far. It was 1944. The war still raged across Europe. But here, in the heart of America, tens of thousands of the enemy were already living a different kind of battle. Not with guns, but with memory, guilt, and disbelief. The guards wore no hatred on their faces. They offered cigarettes, a meal, a nod. For many of these young Germans, it was the first time they saw their supposed enemy act with kindness. Barbed wire gleamed in the late light, but the world beyond it felt strangely open. Inside these American camps, far from the ruins of Berlin, far from the cries of war, something unexpected was happening. The defeated were being treated not as monsters, but as men. And in that small mercy, a quiet transformation began, one that would change them forever. The story of how thousands of German soldiers ended up behind barbed wire in the American heartland begins far from Texas, in the deserts of North Africa. By early 1943, the tide of war had turned. The once victorious Afrika Korps, led by the legendary Erwin Rommel, was being driven back by British and American forces. At Tunisia, the last Axis stronghold on the African continent, more than 250 Zalozan German and Italian troops were captured. It was the largest single mass surrender of Axis forces until the end of the war. The Allies suddenly faced an impossible question: what to do with 250,000 prisoners? Britain, already burdened by bombings and limited space, couldn't hold them all. The answer came from across the Atlantic: the United States. America offered its vast land, its logistical might, and a commitment, at least on paper, to the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Within months, convoys of captured soldiers began their journey across the ocean. Packed into Liberty ships, the men who once fought under Rommel's desert sun found themselves crossing stormy Atlantic waters. No longer conquerors, but captives. They sang old marching songs to stay calm, uncertain what awaited them in this strange land that had once seemed so far from war. When they finally arrived at ports in New York, Virginia, and Louisiana, they expected hostility. Propaganda back home had warned them of American cruelty. Instead, they were met by officers who followed a strict rule: treat them as soldiers, not criminals. From there, trains carried them inland. The U.S. War Department had begun constructing a vast network of POW camps across the country, more than 400 major installations and hundreds of smaller branch camps. These were not hidden away in secret military zones. Many sat just beyond small American towns, beside farms, railroads, and fields of corn. Camps rose in unexpected places: Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Algona in Iowa, Camp McCain in Mississippi, and dozens more. Each surrounded by fences and watchtowers, but designed with a level of comfort that shocked the arriving Germans. Each man was processed, assigned a number, and given standard issue U.S. Army clothing marked PW. They were examined by doctors, fed regularly, and allowed correspondence with families through the Red Cross. For soldiers who had survived the brutal fighting in Africa or Normandy, this was not hell, it was bewildering mercy. American policy was deliberate. President Roosevelt and the War Department understood that how they treated enemy prisoners would reflect on the treatment of Allied POWs held in Europe. Fairness, therefore, was not just moral, it was strategic. Yet, for many townspeople, the sight of former Nazi soldiers working in local fields or strolling under guard was deeply unsettling. Some Americans had lost brothers or sons in the war, Others feared escape attempts or sabotage. But the military's strict supervision and the prisoners' surprisingly good behavior soon softened tensions. Over time, farmers and factory owners began to see the POWs as an unexpected solution to wartime labor shortages. With millions of Americans serving overseas, fields went unplanted and factories lacked hands. The German prisoners filled that gap. Picking cotton in Texas, harvesting wheat in Nebraska, repairing roads in Georgia. They were paid a small wage in canteen credits, enough to buy cigarettes, soap, or stationery. Within the fences, they built a miniature society, bands, football teams, small theaters. It was surreal, a fragment of Germany transplanted to American soil. Still, behind the calm order, a question lingered. What did these men think of the world they had been told to hate? What happened when they saw that the so-called enemy was not the monster of propaganda, but an open, prosperous, and often kind nation? The answer to that question, and the transformation it sparked, began inside these fences, far from the battlefields of Europe. And it began with the realization that captivity, in America, was not punishment, it was revelation. By 1944, the network of German prisoner of war camps in the United States had become one of the largest internment systems in history, housing nearly 425,000 Axis POWs, most of them German. From the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Wisconsin, the camps stretched across the map like a quiet, invisible army of the defeated. Each camp operated under the command of the U.S. Army Service Forces, following a strict set of regulations that combined discipline with dignity. At sunrise, the bugle sounded. Prisoners lined up for roll call, worked their assigned shifts, and returned to their barracks before sunset. But unlike the brutal conditions seen in European camps, American life behind the wire carried a strange sense of normalcy. The barracks were simple but solid, wooden huts with bunks, stoves, and long communal tables. In most camps, POWs received 3 full meals a day, often better than what ordinary Europeans were eating under wartime rationing. They were issued soap, blankets, and clothing. Doctors inspected them regularly. And most astonishing of all, there was freedom within the fences. In Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners formed orchestras and performed classical music for guards and visitors. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, POWs organized theater plays, some even in English. A camp newspaper circulated, written and edited entirely by the prisoners. They debated politics, sketched cartoons, and exchanged letters with their families back home, many of whom were still enduring bombings and scarcity. American officers permitted much of this, guided by the Geneva Convention's principle that a soldier's honor should be preserved even in captivity. This was not Nalr-VDF, it was deliberate psychological policy. U.S. strategists hoped humane treatment might plant seeds of democratic thinking among the captives, especially as Nazi ideology began to collapse. But the reality inside the camps was not without tension. The POWs arrived divided between loyal Nazis, indifferent soldiers, and those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler's war. Early on, these divisions turned violent. Hardcore Nazi elements attempted to enforce ideological control, threatening or attacking those seen as traitors or defeatists. At Camp Tonkawa in 1943, a prisoner suspected of informing American guards was found murdered by his own comrades, hanged inside a latrine. The U.S. Army responded harshly, transferring suspected Nazi leaders to high-security compounds and separating them from the general population. Over time, these actions broke the iron discipline of Nazi loyalty within the camps, allowing ordinary soldiers to breathe and think more freely. The U.S. authorities then went further. By 1944, They had launched a quiet experiment known as the Special Projects Division, a re-education initiative aimed at countering Nazi indoctrination. Selected camps introduced discussion groups, lectures, and libraries filled with translated American literature and newspapers. Prisoners were encouraged to read about democracy, human rights, and free society, ideas that, for many, had been forbidden back home. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, captured officers attended voluntary classes on American government. In Camp Swift, Texas, guards distributed copies of Life magazine and the Saturday Evening Post. German soldiers who once believed in a 1,000-year reich now saw photographs of American families, industries, and cities untouched by dictatorship. The most striking reactions came not from the books, but from the fields outside the wire. POWs working alongside American civilians, farmers, mechanics, cooks, witnessed a society without secret police, without propaganda banners, without fear. For men raised under the swastika, it was disorienting and deeply humanizing. By the war's final months, a quiet transformation had taken root. Letters intercepted by censors revealed changing tones, no longer filled with hatred or arrogance, but with confusion, curiosity, even admiration. One prisoner wrote, "If this is the enemy, then what have we been fighting for?" The United States had not only captured its enemies, it was reshaping them. As Europe lay in ruins and Germany prepared for unconditional surrender, these men inside the wire were beginning to question everything they had believed in. And soon, America would realize that it wasn't just imprisoning soldiers, it was hosting the birth of new minds. At first, most German prisoners entered American soil with fear that bordered on terror. They had been told they'd be tortured or executed, that Americans were brutal, uncivilized, and driven by vengeance. Instead, they found polite guards, organized rations, and even coffee, a luxury long vanished from Germany. It was this very normality that disarmed them. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, men who once fought in the sands of Tunisia now spent mornings tending crops or fixing fences. American guards, many no older than themselves, sometimes shared cigarettes during work breaks. They spoke of baseball, not battle. Slowly, the silence between them began to soften. The human bond that emerged was quiet, but profound. Local families in nearby towns saw the prisoners in the fields, and curiosity began to outweigh fear. Farmers soon realized the POWs were reliable, hardworking, and often grateful for simple kindness. A few towns even began sending Christmas parcels to the camps, small tokens of goodwill that astonished the Germans. Inside the wire, these gestures took on deeper meaning. The enemy had become human again. The camps, once symbols of defeat, began to feel like schools in humility and windows into another kind of civilization. Many of the POWs were only teenagers. They had grown up under Hitler's education system, taught to see the world through hate. In America, they encountered something Hitler's Germany could never show them: a society where authority could be questioned, and dignity did not depend on rank. One prisoner later recalled, "It was the first time I was treated as a person, not as a soldier or number." That quiet humanity did more to defeat Nazism than any propaganda leaflet ever could. While the workdays were long, the evenings inside the camps came alive with unexpected energy. Within months, the Germans had turned barracks into classrooms. They formed orchestras, staged theater plays, and printed newsletters. Camp libraries flourished. Thousands of donated books, from Goethe to Mark Twain, from military manuals to American novels. This intellectual life wasn't just tolerated by the Americans. It was encouraged. The War Department believed an occupied mind was less likely to resist, but there was also a deeper motive: to expose prisoners to the power of free thought. Lectures on geography, mathematics, and philosophy were organized by educated POWs, many of them former teachers or university students drafted into war. Camp guards noticed that debates soon shifted from tactical discussions to moral ones. The men began to ask, how had Germany fallen so far? How had we believed so deeply in something so cruel? Cultural exchange also happened in subtle ways. American movies were screened under supervision: Casablanca, Stagecoach, The Maltese Falcon. For many prisoners, it was their first glimpse of American storytelling: romantic, witty, self-critical. They saw societies that mocked their own flaws, that allowed heroes and villains to coexist within one story. In Camp Algona, prisoners built a full-scale model village for Christmas, complete with a miniature church and glowing windows made from tin and glass. American officers were invited to the unveiling. They watched as the same men who had once fought under the Iron Cross sang carols under the stars of Iowa. It was peaceful, even beautiful, a moment that blurred the lines between captor and captive. By 1945, the camps had evolved into small laboratories of democracy, places where German soldiers were slowly learning not through punishment, but through observation. They began to see what a world without fear looked like. As the war in Europe neared its end, the U.S. government formalized what had begun organically: re-education. The Special Projects Division, directed by Major Maxwell McKnight and intellectual advisors, launched a nationwide program called Der Ruf, the Call. Its purpose was to replace Nazi indoctrination with democratic understanding. Camp newspapers printed essays on freedom of speech and civic responsibility. Radio broadcasts in German discussed the rebuilding of Europe. Books banned under Hitler, by Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, and Erich Maria Remarque, reappeared in camp libraries. Participation was voluntary, but interest grew rapidly. By 1945, over half of the German POW population had engaged in some form of educational or cultural activity. What began as lectures soon turned into honest self-examination. Some soldiers confessed they had joined the Wehrmacht out of duty, not belief. Others began writing letters to families, urging them to question the Nazi regime's lies. It was not indoctrination, it was illumination. And while not every man changed, thousands did. Years later, historians noted that many of the returning POWs became the moral backbone of post-war West Germany, the generation that rebuilt the nation on democratic ideals. Behind the fences of Kansas, Texas, and Georgia, a quiet moral awakening was taking place. The war had taken their homeland. America, unexpectedly, gave them a second one, inside their minds. The shift was underway. The German soldier who had once fought for a dictator was now fighting his own conscience. The barbed wire no longer felt like a cagey, it felt like a mirror. The humane treatment of German POWs was not an accident of compassion, it was a calculated political experiment. Behind the civility, the U.S. government saw an opportunity to use these men as the raw material for a future democratic Germany. In Washington, officials of the War Department's Special Projects Division debated the moral limits of influence. Could an enemy soldier be converted through kindness? Could democracy be taught to men who had sworn allegiance to a totalitarian state? The camps became the testing grounds for that idea. Every element, from food rations to reading material, was part of a deliberate design. The Geneva Convention was not merely followed, it was showcased. Each POWs who wrote home about fair treatment became a living contradiction to Nazi propaganda. Letters were censored, yes, but not rewritten. American strategists wanted truth to travel back across the Atlantic, that the enemy respected honor, even in defeat. As the re-education programs deepened, American officers began to identify prisoners who showed leadership potential. These men were quietly separated, trained, and given responsibilities, managing work crews, running internal affairs, even organizing cultural events. The idea was simple: teach leadership through liberty. When the war finally ended, these same individuals would become essential to Germany's rebirth. Historians later traced dozens of West German civic leaders, educators, and writers back to their time in American captivity. For the U.S., this was soft power before the term existed. Democracy by demonstration. And though it lacked the heroism of battle, its impact would last far longer. But such experiments carried risks. If humane treatment was seen as indulgence, it could provoke outrage at home. In Congress, some lawmakers argued the government was spoiling Nazi prisoners while American boys died overseas. The War Department defended its policy fiercely, pointing to a single principle: war fight tyranny, not men. This political gamble, moral strength over vengeance, would later define the American post-war identity itself. For the prisoners, morality was no longer an abstract idea discussed in classrooms. It was a daily test. Many had participated in campaigns that devastated Europe. Some had fought in units implicated in atrocities. Others claimed ignorance. But none could escape the collective guilt that hung over their homeland. As the war news filtered into the camps, the shock was overwhelming. Newspapers announced the collapse of Berlin, the suicide of Hitler, and finally the discovery of the concentration camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. For many Germans, this was the true moment of captivity. Not physical but spiritual, they had lost not only their nation, but their innocence. In Camp Trinidad, Colorado, the American officers allowed POWs to read the full reports of Nazi crimes. Reactions varied: denial, disbelief, tears. Some refused to accept it. Others withdrew in silence. But a few began writing in the camp newspapers, confronting the horror openly. One essay read, "If this is true, then our defeat is the only justice." Guards recalled that after these reports spread, the camp atmosphere changed. The arrogance vanished. The sense of military pride gave way to reflection. The same men who had once sang marching songs now spent evenings in quiet debate. Some prisoners took up faith again, others turned to philosophy or art. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, a former architecture student began sketching churches and schools for the Germany he hoped to rebuild. In another camp, a group of POWs formed a study circle named Neues Deutschland, New Germany, where they envisioned a society based on law, not power. The moral rebirth was not universal. A minority clung stubbornly to old ideology, but the majority began to understand that freedom was not weakness, and compassion was not defeat. That realization, born within fences, would later guide their generation as West Germany emerged from the ashes. Perhaps the most powerful transformation inside these camps was internal: the reshaping of identity. To lose a war is one thing, to lose a worldview is another. When captured, many POWs saw themselves as soldiers of a superior nation. But in America, they met strength without cruelty, power without fear. That contradiction slowly dismantled their indoctrination. Psychologists who later interviewed returning POWs noted recurring words: respect, decency, shame, and hope inside the camps. They had experienced structure without oppression, order without terror. They had discovered that one could follow rules and still remain human. Even after years of captivity, the German prisoners were treated not as lost causes, but as men capable of renewal. That faith in their humanity became contagious. It was, as one guard later said, the quietest victory of the war. The fences still stood, the guards still watched, but the war within these men had shifted. The Americans had not broken them, they had rebuilt them. And soon, as Germany lay in ruins and the Allies declared victory, those same men would be asked to return home, to a homeland they no longer fully recognized. What they carried back would not be weapons or medals, but a new understanding of freedom. Spring of 1945. Across Europe, the war was collapsing like a house of cards. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime, once seemingly eternal, was crumbling in days. Inside the American POW camps, the news arrived slowly, in bursts of radio announcements, letters, and the rare newspaper smuggled through the Red Cross. At Camp Swift, Texas, a group of prisoners huddled around a single shortwave radio, listening to the voice of Edward R. Murrow broadcasting the surrender of German forces in Italy. Some cheered quietly. Others stared in stunned silence, unable to process the speed of Germany's collapse. For many, it was the first time the war felt truly personal. Up to that moment, captivity had been abstract, a series of routines, work details, and polite conversations. Now, reality struck. Their homeland was defeated. Families were in ruins. Cities lay in ash. The ideology that had consumed their youth was dead. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had once feared being shot for desertion now questioned why they had followed orders so blindly. Conversations in barracks shifted from tactical anecdotes to confessions. Men recounted their actions in North Africa, Italy, and France. Some spoke of the civilians they had seen suffer, others of comrades they had lost. Guilt was as pervasive as the sun overhead. At Camp Algona, Iowa, a former Luftwaffe soldier, barely 20, broke down while painting a mural depicting an imagined Germany of peace. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, officers allowed a silent vigil. Prisoners gathering at dusk to hear the news of Hitler's death and Germany's surrender read aloud. The moment was both liberating and terrifying. For decades, these men had been told the enemy was monstrous, the Allies cruel, and defeat dishonorable. Now they were forced to confront the truth: the enemy had been humane, the world was indifferent to Nazi ideology, and victory had not been guaranteed by virtue or valor, but by the collapse of a deluded nation. The U.S. authorities observed quietly. They did not interfere, only recorded. Reports described camp populations sitting in unprecedented silence. Letters rewritten to families containing messages of reflection, rather than bravado, and intellectual discussions, replacing previous ideological chanting. One of the most intense moments came at Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The senior German officer received word that several of his men had died in Allied bombing raids on their hometowns, while he remained alive and secure. He walked alone among the barracks, addressing no one, trying to reconcile relief with shame. That evening, he convened an informal council, not of command, but of conscience, urging men to consider the meaning of obedience, loyalty, and morality. It was the first time a camp became a moral battlefield rather than a military one. Arguments erupted between hardened loyalists and those disillusioned by the news from Europe. Guards reported shouting matches over ideology, tears over destroyed families, and in some cases, laughter at the absurdity of the Nazi collapse. The camps also witnessed acts of reconciliation. Prisoners who had once refused to speak to comrades labeled defeatists now embraced them. Soldiers who had been reluctant to work or learn English suddenly volunteered for canteen duty or library management. Some even requested permission to stay in the U.S. after the war. A shocking testament to the transformation occurring inside the fences. The final weeks of European combat coincided with what historians call the psychological turning point in the camps. Military defeat forced soldiers to examine their beliefs. Humane treatment encouraged reflection rather than rebellion. Exposure to American culture planted seeds of critical thought. By May 8, 1945, V-Day, the camps were no longer prisons in the purely physical sense. They had become crucibles of identity, morality, and ideology. For the prisoners, surrender was no longer an external event. It was internal. The defeat of the Reich mirrored the collapse of their certainties. Guards witnessed men reading newspapers for hours, writing letters that attempted to reconcile loyalty with conscience, and quietly planning for a future they could barely imagine. By the time the first orders for repatriation arrived, most POWs were profoundly changed. Those who had arrived in 1943 believing the Allies to be monsters now understood them as complex human beings. Those who had clung to Nazi ideology now debated governance, justice, and ethics. And those who had once defined themselves solely as soldiers now saw themselves as men capable of thought, reflection, and empathy. This was the climax of the American POW experiment. Not in battle or combat, but in the war within. The fences had not only contained bodies, they had contained and reshaped minds. And as the first transports prepared to return to Europe, a new question loomed: how would these men confront a Germany that no longer existed as they had imagined it? May 1945. Ships, trains, and trucks began moving the first waves of German prisoners back to a Europe in ruins. The camps that had once held them now pulsed with anticipation, anxiety, and an unfamiliar sense of liberation. Yet freedom was bittersweet. Many POWs had spent years immersed in American life. They had learned English, cultivated friendships with guards, and participated in cultural and educational programs. For the first time, the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht was replaced by dialogue, debate, and, in some cases, laughter. Leaving the camps meant returning to a homeland they hardly recognized, bombed out cities, displaced families, and a society grappling with shame and devastation. At Camp Swift, Texas, the farewell ceremonies were modest. Prisoners stood silently while American officers offered a few words of farewell. A handful asked if they could remain in the United States, a request met with polite refusal. Soldiers clasped hands, hugged, and exchanged addresses with guards and townspeople who had become, in some ways, friends. On the trains heading east, conversations reflected the inner transformation each man had undergone. Young soldiers, who had once boasted of their obedience to Hitler, now spoke of democratic principles, civic responsibility, and moral accountability. Letters home conveyed not triumph, but reflection. In them, POWs urged their families to question the past, rebuild communities, and embrace a future not dictated by fear or ideology. The journey was physically long and emotionally taxing. Prisoners witnessed the devastation of German cities for the first time. Hamburg and Dresden, leveled by Allied bombers, became symbols not of victory, but of human cost. For those who had lived through the brutality of war, the ruins reinforced a new understanding of responsibility and consequence. Many returning officers were tasked with overseeing reconstruction in their own neighborhoods. They found themselves mediators, educators, and leaders in towns desperate for stability. Some were haunted by memories of actions taken in the name of orders. Others sought redemption by helping civilians rebuild schools, hospitals, and homes. The long-term effects were profound. A remarkable number of former POWs, who had experienced the humane treatment of Americans, went on to advocate for democratic reform. They became teachers, journalists, and politicians committed to rebuilding a society based on dialogue rather than obedience, empathy rather than coercion. Historians later noted that this generation, those shaped by captivity, became the backbone of post-war West Germany. Their exposure to humane authority, critical thought, and cultural freedom had inoculated them against the ideological rigidity that had fueled the Third Reich. In countless interviews, returning POWs spoke of America not just as a captor, but as a model of values that might rebuild a shattered world. Yet the departure was not without sorrow. Many had formed bonds with guards and civilians who had welcomed them in an unfamiliar land. Children in nearby towns had grown attached to the prisoners, and some guards mourned the loss of friendships forged in shared routines and quiet trust. Even the landscapes left behind, the rolling fields of Kansas, the warm plains of Texas, the quiet forests of Tennessee, carried memories. For the first time, German soldiers saw the paradox of captivity. It had constrained their bodies but liberated their minds. The barbed wire that once symbolized defeat now marked the space where identity, morality, and understanding had been tested and reshaped. By the time the last trains crossed the Atlantic, a silent revolution had occurred. The war had ended on the battlefield, but inside the POW camps, a war of conscience, culture, and education had been quietly won. Germany would rebuild, and a generation shaped by humane captivity would carry lessons learned behind fences into a world struggling to recover from devastation. As the gates closed for the final time, the transformation was complete. Men who had arrived hardened by ideology, suspicion, and fear were leaving thoughtful, reflective, and quietly determined to prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. The fences that once confined them had done more than hold prisoners. They had contained the conditions for moral awakening, cultural discovery, and personal redemption. A crucible that would echo for decades in the reconstruction of a nation and in the shaping of the post-war world. And with that, the stage was set for a new chapter, both for the men who returned home and for a Germany that had yet to find itself. The war in Europe was over. On May 8, 1945, victory had been declared, and millions of soldiers returned to civilian life. But for the German POWs in the United States, a different journey awaited, one that would test resilience, morality, and memory. Repatriation began slowly. Ships transported the men back to a shattered homeland, a Germany where cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin lay in ruins. Factories were destroyed, infrastructure crippled, and millions of civilians were displaced, hungry, and traumatized. The soldiers who had survived the battlefield now faced a homecoming steeped in uncertainty. For those who had been imprisoned in the American camps, the contrast could not have been starker. In the U.S., they had been fed, clothed, and treated with dignity. They had access to education, culture, and even leisure. In Germany, they returned to rubble, rationing, and suspicion. The shock of returning to destruction was magnified by the moral awakening many had experienced during captivity. Some men, once loyal to Hitler, now grappled with their role in a regime that had led their nation to ruin. Yet their time in American camps had given them tools to survive psychologically. They had learned discipline, patience, and reflection. Letters from POWs reveal a recurring theme: the realization that survival alone was not enough. Rebuilding required conscience, judgment, and courage. Many wrote home urging their families to embrace practical rebuilding, democratic principles, and a rejection of the ideology that had caused such devastation. For younger soldiers, who had spent formative years behind barbed wire. The return to Germany was both liberating and daunting. Some felt alienated, unable to relate fully to the propaganda-fed generation that remained in pockets of the country. Others struggled to reconcile their humane treatment abroad with the suffering they now witnessed at home. The camp's influence was evident in postwar reports. In Bavaria and Lower Saxony, returning POWs who had been exposed to American culture and re-education programs became advocates for local reconstruction, teaching, and democratic governance. Former soldiers participated in civic councils, vocational training programs, and community initiatives. Their first-hand experience of a functioning society that valued human dignity shaped their decisions and leadership. Not all transformations were immediate. Some soldiers reverted to cynicism or despair upon witnessing devastation. Others faced suspicion from neighbors who assumed any former soldier was loyal to Nazism. But over time, the cumulative effect of their American experience became clear. They carried with them a model of order, fairness, and moral responsibility that influenced post-war German society in subtle but profound ways. Historians note that the POW experience in the U.S. created a cadre of men uniquely equipped to rebuild, both materially and ethically. Many became educators, administrators, and civic leaders, helping steer West Germany toward democracy, while avoiding the extremes that had led to war. The camps had not simply contained prisoners. They had cultivated a generation capable of reflecting on the past and guiding the future. The physical scars of captivity faded quickly after repatriation. Barracks, fences, and watchtowers were dismantled. But the psychological and cultural impact persisted. Former POs spoke of their time in America with awe and gratitude, recounting how exposure to respect, humane treatment, and education reshaped their understanding of the world. Even decades later, the American experience remained a reference point for ethical behavior, civic responsibility, and moral accountability. Veterans of the camps reflected on how captivity had paradoxically liberated their minds. They had entered as soldiers of a defeated ideology. They left as men capable of shaping a society founded on reflection, justice, and humanity. The war had ended in Europe with military victory. But inside the POW camps of the United States, another battle had been quietly fought. A battle for conscience, for understanding, and for the very soul of a nation poised to rise from ashes. The stage was now set for the full social and cultural aftermath, a chapter in which these transformed men would carry lessons back to a Germany struggling to redefine itself. The journey home was not merely physical, it was an emotional and moral odyssey. Ships crossing the Atlantic carried men who had left as soldiers of the Third Reich, but would return as witnesses to a different reality. A world where their enemy had treated them with dignity, where debate had replaced doctrine, and where survival included reflection. In Germany, the consequences of war were unavoidable. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were shattered, and millions of civilians faced hunger and homelessness. Returning POWs confronted the immediacy of loss, families displaced, villages obliterated, and the haunting evidence of the Holocaust emerging from liberated camps. For many, these realities compounded the moral reckonings begun in American captivity. Yet, the experiences in the U.S. camps had equipped them with perspective. Former POWs noted the stark contrast between the efficiency, order, and humanity of American camp life, and the chaos and cruelty that had governed wartime Germany. This contrast became a lens through which they interpreted their nation's collapse. Some wrote essays and memoirs, reflecting on how humane treatment had reshaped their sense of responsibility ethics, and leadership, communities quickly discovered that these returning men were different. In towns across Bavaria, Lower Saxony, and North Rhine-Westphalia, ex-POWs who had participated in cultural and educational programs in America became informal teachers and mentors. They introduced democratic practices in village councils, organized schools, and advocated for civic engagement. The American influence was subtle yet enduring. It manifested in governance, civil discourse, and a willingness to rebuild through cooperation rather than coercion. The impact extended into the political sphere. Former POWs who had been exposed to education and cultural programs were disproportionately represented among post-war civic leaders, educators, and administrators. They carried the experience of humane treatment into their communities, often serving as mediators and advisors during the complex period of Reconstruction. Their voices became instrumental in shaping West Germany's democratic framework. In personal terms, the psychological aftermath was complex. Many ex-POWs struggled with guilt for their role in the war, for surviving when others had not, and for returning to a homeland devastated by their nation's ideology. Letters and diaries reveal recurring themes of reflection, remorse, and determination to contribute positively to society. Yet there was also gratitude, a recognition that their time in the United States had provided a rare opportunity for moral clarity and self-examination. For American observers, the results of the POW program validated their approach. Reports compiled by the War Department after repatriation concluded that humane treatment, exposure to culture and education, and structured responsibilities had a measurable effect on prisoner attitudes. Thousands of men returned with a more nuanced understanding of democracy, justice, and individual responsibility, a quiet success that would reverberate through post-war Germany and influence Cold War dynamics. The legacy of the camps endured for decades. Former POWs recounted their experiences to children, students, and colleagues, emphasizing lessons learned from captivity, the power of human dignity, the importance of moral reflection, and the capacity for transformation even in the wake of defeat. Institutions in Germany later incorporated these narratives into historical education, ensuring that the humane treatment and cultural exposure provided in American camps were remembered as a counterpoint to totalitarian indoctrination. By 1946 and 1947, as the final transports returned, it became clear that the POW experience in America had left an indelible mark, not only on individuals, but on the moral and civic reconstruction of a nation. Germany was rebuilding from rubble, but it was also rebuilding from conscience, guided by men who had witnessed the alternative, a society that valued human life, education, and reflection even in wartime. The fences, barracks, and guard towers were dismantled, leaving only memories. Yet in the minds and hearts of the returning soldiers, the transformation remained, a testament to the profound, enduring influence of humane captivity. As these men reintegrated into German society, they carried with them a message that would echo for generations. Even in war, dignity and humanity can prevail. And that quiet triumph set the stage for the final reflection, a meditation on what it truly means to be human, even amid the chaos of global conflict. In the quiet fields of Texas, Kansas, and Tennessee, the war's roar had been replaced by whispers, the subtle murmurs of minds awakening. Barbed wire confined bodies, but it could not contain thought, conscience, or morality. What the American POW camps achieved was not measured in battles won or lost, but in human transformation. These men, once soldiers of a brutal regime, entered captivity hardened by ideology, fear, and duty. They left years later with something far more enduring perspective. They had witnessed the humanity of those they were taught to hate. They had debated, studied, and reflected in ways impossible on European battlefields. They had learned that obedience without conscience was hollow, and that strength could coexist with kindness. The story of these camps is a paradox. War, which had destroyed lives and nations, became the unlikely backdrop for a moral and cultural experiment. Here, behind fences and watchtowers, defeated soldiers encountered a mirror of what society could be: a world governed not by terror, but by order tempered with dignity. And in that reflection, they found the seeds of personal and societal renewal. When the prisoners returned to a devastated Germany, they carried these lessons home. Their experiences influenced the rebuilding of communities, the formation of democratic institutions, and the shaping of a nation determined to avoid repeating the horrors of the past. History would judge battles and campaigns, but these quiet transformations were no less significant. They were victories of the human spirit. Victories that unfolded not with guns, but with thought, reflection, and compassion. Ultimately, the story of the U.S. POW camps is a testament to a profound truth: that even in the darkest chapters of history, the seeds of morality, understanding, and renewal can take root. Captivity became liberation of a different kind, a liberation of mind, conscience, and hope. And it serves as a reminder that humanity, even amid war, can choose the path of dignity over destruction and compassion over cruelty. In these camps, the enemy became human, the defeated became reflective, and the lessons endured far beyond the fences, shaping not only individuals, but the very fabric of a post-war world.